Thank you all for joining us this evening for our third in our series of conversations across continents. In our attempt to better understand the movement of garden ideas, styles, and plants across the globe, we have this term traveled to the Philippines, and we also explored some of the fascinating links between Brazil and the Netherlands. Tonight, we move to northern Italy, in the 16th century, where an interest in Islamic Spain was cultivated by an elite and learned class of villa gardeners and travelers. This exchange between Italy and Moorish Spain has been close to Christopher's heart for some time. He received his Ph.D. in the history of art from Penn with a dissertation that explored villa ideology in the early modern Veneto, and he is currently revising a manuscript on 16th century Italian villa culture, tentatively titled Cultivating Antiquity, which we eagerly await. His previous publications include studies of allegories and gender identity, garden aesthetics and Renaissance theory, and the influence of the Islamic world on Venetian gardens. And that's why we are here this evening. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome him to London this evening. Live from Pennsylvania, it's Christopher Pastore.
Oh, thanks so much, Christine. Really happy to be with everybody today. I'd like to thank the IHR faculty and Professor LaLumia for inviting me to present at your garden history seminar. The topic of Italian Renaissance gardens has been something I've returned to for decades, although with my duties as a program director and administrator, I don't dig into research very much now. Christine was worried if I might want to revisit this material because I did it first 20 years ago in my dissertation and might not want to talk about it now. But as we talked about the seminar, it became abundantly clear that my exploration of this connection between the gardens we visit in Italy and the Veneto now and the many Islamic Mediterranean landscapes that the early modern Venetians visited would fit nicely into this seminar on the history of gardens and landscapes. Speaking with you today is a wonderful opportunity to share some of my work and retrace my scholarly footsteps on paths I first walked in the 1980s and to which I have returned on more than one occasion. My graduate work on the impact Islamic landscapes had on Italian gardens was actually itself a retrospective project. 35 years ago, I was in David Coffin's Renaissance and Baroque Landscape and Garden Architecture course as an undergraduate. It was a truly remarkable course taught by an incredibly knowledgeable professor. My final paper for the term was my first foray into a study of the explosive and playful waterworks increasingly central to Italian gardens like the Villa d'Este and the Villa Lante that were both built in the 16th century. I'm sure many of you have visited some of these splendid gardens and remember the delightful fountains, the murmuring watercourses, and the calm reflecting pools at these gardens. You might also recall that many of the mid-16th century gardens are dramatically different than earlier Italian gardens in terms of the volume, amount, and the formula they approached their gardens in terms of prolific waterworks and imaginative hydraulic displays. As I wrote, I found myself wrestling with a throwaway passage in Marie-Louise Gotein's History of Garden Art, in which she introduced the Venetian ambassador Andrea Navigero in her chapter on Islamic gardens and the Alhambra. Gothein quoted his letters and then hinted at the possibility that his letters from Spain influenced the way moving active water and still reflective pools may have been integrated into Italian Renaissance gardens later in the century. Coffin seemed to like my paper, but in his notes, he remarked that the middle bit was a bit underwhelming. And by this, he meant the structural elements that connected the paper that could better explain how anyone in Italy actually learned about Islamic landscapes in the Mediterranean and why they care about them at all. And then he sent me on my way. I've always been a rather stubborn sort, and I recalled his comments 6 or 7 years later when I was on deadline to deliver a dissertation abstract for my next year of funding and my PhD program. And I had been doing a range of coursework in Renaissance art, but also in Islamic art and architecture. And I casually threw out an idea that I was now prepared to make the argument stick that I hadn't made very effectively in my undergraduate paper. My mentor, Professor Renata Hollig, here at Penn, was an Islamicist. So she was happy to let me take this project out on the road and run it down and see if I could chase the idea down and pin it down in some way that was more coherent than anything that had been done previously by historians of the landscape and garden architecture in the Renaissance. My research actually pivoted on the theory that 16th century Italians were not die-hard classical revivalists, and that an assortment of prototypes proved to be useful to the cultural elite who invested in and enjoyed the gardens that we know best. In particular, Andrea Navaggero and his circle stood out as a key unit of the large class of villa builders who integrated new plants and new ideas about garden design into those that they created in Venice and across the Venetian terra firma provinces. And this made sense to me because Venice has long been understood as a nexus for trade throughout most of the 1,000-year run of the Republic. Now, one characteristic that stood out to me and that I chased down for years was the willingness of this Venetian elite to find common ground with potential competitors as they negotiated business deals and diplomatic relationships. Their success relied in part on an awareness of and an interest in the history and culture of their neighbors, both allies and enemies, and their willingness to learn about and borrow from everyone, including the Ottomans and new players like the indigenous peoples in the Americas. And this is something I've come to understand suggests they were really rather receptive and dynamic as a class, as a group of people. Examples of this include Venetian studies of Islamic medicine and Native American pharmacology, topics I've explored in previous essays about the mural painter Orazio Farinati and his images of the American continent, and the polymath Girolamo Fracastoro and his seminal work on diseases, especially his work on the French sickness or syphilis. As I learned more about Navaggero, I found myself in sort of a paper chase, tied to the extraordinarily powerful printing industry in Venice and the circulation of descriptions of Islamic landscapes across Italy to the cultural elite, not just in Venice, but in Florence and Rome. Because I was hoping to know if there was any likelihood that a traveler saw something in Spain or Egypt or Syria, and that they might then publish it and it could ultimately land on the desk of a prince or cardinal contemplating their new landscape design project in Lazio or Tuscany or where else you might encounter these gardens in Italy. The first printed version of Navaggero's letters was published by Domenico Fari in Venice in Il Viaggio Fatto in Spagna in 1563. And the dedication was to a Veronese prince, and it indicated that the gardens Navaggero described would be worthy models for this prince, Lepido da Malaspina, who was at the time currently remodeling several properties he owned in the Valpolicella. The Marchese Malaspina's various holdings in the Veronese exhibit some fascinating but very faint influence in the things Navaggero describes, although the efforts made to connect the pleasure gardens with the agricultural lands of his properties, he had a big casa statale, a villa with a pleasure garden, and then land that was being developed to grow cash crops. And this included new crops like corn and rice in the 16th century. But those things are really faint and hard to see. And I actually stumbled into some over the years during research, and particularly on one early trip back in the days of film as opposed to digital cameras. And I climbed barbed wire fences, I scurried under drainage ditches to get around buildings, but all my images are no longer with us because I also made the mistake of taking pictures of the Palazzo Bembo in Padua with the same roll of film that day, and it's a military army base, and the security officer confiscated my film. So sadly, I haven't had a chance to get back there, and the gardens I looked at, and you can see that on the slide, one of which is the old gardens around what was the Villa Malaspina in Casteldazzano is now a luxury hotel. So all of the things that I found on the property that I couldn't document successfully because I lost my film are no longer visible. But since I was out there literally crawling around the terrain of the Veneto and finding things that connected Malaspina's property to Navaggero's letters to Islamic Spain, I thought I was on the right track, and I figured I would keep going with this project. The next major discovery for me connected the printer, Fari, and Navaggero's letters with a new generation of patrons in Italy. And this is the key to the matter for me, because it really helps us understand why Italian gardens changed so much in the 1540s and 1550s. Navaggero's nephew, Bernardo, was a cardinal by the middle of the century, and he spent many years in Rome, during which period he was closely connected with a number of the fellow prelates like Ippolito d'Este And that could explain why his uncle's writings would have reached a receptive audience far beyond Venice. More importantly, Fari and other printers were linked to Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici, who financed an Islamic press, the Medici Tipografia Orientale, that was designed and launched and financed as an exercise in sharing information about the Islamic world with a European audience and sharing information that Europeans wanted readers of Arabic to consume. And this included works by Euclid, it included the Bible and the Quran and a number of very interesting treatises. Sadly, although they printed a number of works, most of them ended up sitting on the shelves in the offices in the Villa Medici on the Pincio and never actually got sold on the market. So I don't know that this communication effort really took flight, if you will. The Medici press published only a few works, but what's fascinating is you can see on the slide, on the far image on the right, they were published in Arabic with a new type of graphic character cut by Roberto Bragnon, who was a great typesetter. And then they had interlinear translation, either back into Arabic or into English, so that audiences could read these in more than one language. The work that I was interested in was a strange work called A Book of Gardens and Miraculous Places. It was the very first book the Medici Arabic press printed, and it indicated that their direct stipulated mission statement, which was to share all licit knowledge between Arab speakers and Europeans, seemed to jive with what Cardinal Fernando was doing, which was a major garden expansion that he was doing in Rome at the time. And you can even see that the impresa of the Medici Tipografia Orientale is fascinating because it's a hand coming out, divine hand coming out of the clouds, dropping seeds on this wonderful agricultural landscape, right? And they were publishing works on universal geography and on strange garden places. And this is the only illustration in that book. And it was a garden labyrinth that was supposed to mark some special feature of the garden, which was quite wonderful and interesting on the face of it. As I followed this new trail, I began to learn more about Ferdinando in order to better understand how ideas about Islamic culture that piqued his interest as a cardinal in Rome managed to carry forward and perhaps influence the expansion of the Medici gardens of the urban Oltrarno city residence of the Tuscan Grand Dukes at the Pitti Palace. What came next was quite surprising. Ferdinando was the fifth son of the first Grand Duke Cosimo de' Medici. As the third surviving son, he seemed unlikely to succeed his father and was sent off to represent Medici interests in Rome as a cardinal, with an eye on possibly becoming the third Medici pope. However, things being what they were, one older brother died young, and the heir, Grand Duke Francesco I, his second brother, died childless in 1587. At that point, Ferdinando renounced his title as cardinal and returned to Florence as the next Grand Duke. He was immediately thrown into the marriage market and made what was really ultimately a brilliant match with Christine de Lorraine in 1589. You're probably wondering how this all ties into gardens, but it does, because the preparations for this dynastic wedding featured transformative work on the Boboli Gardens and an over-the-top week of nuptial festivities that announced to all who attended that the Medici were power players in Europe and they intended to expand their influence across Italy. And in the Boboli, what I found fascinating was immediately after the 1589 weddings, there were a number of projects begun to expand the Boboli. These gardens were small, as you can see in the Uten's lunette from 1595, which was painted and hung in the Medici villa. And I think it was, it's now in the Museum of Florence, past and present, but it hung in one of the villa properties out in the suburbs. But they embarked on a big expansion of the gardens that moved down to the Porta Romana over here and expanded the size of the garden by probably 2/3. And in the process, they added an orangery and other interesting features that included these water channels that carried fresh water on a regular basis from the top of the garden down in every direction, going towards the palace and down towards the gate that left the city. There's no water running them today, but they're really interesting and fascinating things that aren't really seen by most people as important elements of the garden architecture today, but they were really interesting parts of the sort of the connective hydrology that linked different parts of the gardens to each other. During a week of celebration, The bride and groom, the Grand Duke and his wife, treated their guests to banquets and performances. Original theatrical and musical compositions included a magical series of plays about classical myths meant to underscore the growing power of the Medici that was being reinforced with Ferdinando's marriage to the granddaughter of Catherine de' Medici and King Henry II of France. The intermezzi of the series of plays were musical extravaganzas that were the immediate precursors of full-fledged opera, and the settings and costumes were created by the renowned artist Bernardo Buontalenti. What intrigued me most was Buontalenti's watercolor sketches for a scene in one of these intermezzo that happened in ancient Delphi. Perhaps responding to Ferdinando's prompts, the artist conjured up a splendid group of ancient Delphic residents, the denizens of this famous mystical Greek place up on the mountains, who danced about the new theater that was now behind the Pig Palace, complete with turbans, pantaloons, slippers with curved-pointed toes. These dancing Turks, as I've called them, summoned up a sense of mystery and distance that asked viewers to recognize in them something quite different and other to the people they encountered every day, and perhaps also in the seats next to them at the spectacle. To me, it actually meant something else. I took a page from David Lowenthal's really amazing book, The Past is a Foreign Country, and I realized the inverse might be plausible. And thus I ventured that something noticeably foreign, like costume or customs, could similarly tell viewers that difference was real, but more importantly, that distance across geography was psychologically consistent with a difference across time. So in other words, ancient Delphi was most assuredly not inhabited by modern Italians, and that the difference signaled by Ottoman or Eastern dress denoted a vast difference comparable to the long passage of time back into pre-modern Greece in the deep past. So to me, these figures are part and parcel of an effort to come to grips with the past that was central to Renaissance art and to Italian garden design that I call an expanded antiquity. New paradigms were invaluable for Venetians. Modern scholars like Brian Wilson have looked at Venetian printed works on dress and found an appetite for the exotic that fit in neatly with the ongoing mercantile hub, but that also offered a range of models for Venetians responding to economic and political changes and investing in the provinces of the mainland to compensate for shrinking opportunities in international trade. You can see, for example, in this view of a procession of the Doge, that up in the balconies above the shops are a series of individuals catching the view, but also some individuals who are not Venetians, these wonderful folks in these spectacular turbans looking out at what's going on in Venetian society in this great procession. Paintings by the Bellini family, like this painting of St. Mark preaching in Alexandria by Giovanni Belli, feature splendid mashups of the ancient and modern, as well as the exotic and quotidian, putting St. Mark in front of a rather fanciful Neo-Byzantine Venetian San Zaccaria, translocated into Alexandria, smack dab full of a city that has Roman and Muslim architectural bits and pieces, and he's speaking to a rapt audience of men and women in nuns' habits, turbans, and togas. Similarly, Rosamund Mack and Deborah Howard have sought out further examples of architectural and artistic influences on Venetian monumental architecture and in Venetian painting that parallel the kind of signaling I pointed out in Buontalenti's Florentine spectacle costumes. Consider the wonderful appropriation of features of the now lost lighthouse of Alexandria, and here's a reconstruction that were used in the construction of the bell tower of Campanile of the Venetian Cathedral of San Pietro in Castello. So you'll notice the interesting change from the recessed rectangular elements into a larger fenestrated area, and then a strange octagonal multi-sided structure that sits before a top that's domed or covered in some kind of pinnacle. And this is a really playful reference to something that an artist or their patron brought home as an idea of something they saw outside of Venice that they recognized fit into the Venetian world in their head. And they brought them home for people who couldn't travel to see and experience. And they worked these into the built environment of the Venetian lived experience. For me, this then opened the door to return to Navagero's descriptions of gardens and seek out other contemporary traveler accounts and pin down possible sites in Venice where new gardens could have been experimental places that paved the way for later 16th century advancements in landscape design. In other words, it appeared that there was a web of connections that I could now start to chase down that linked Papal Rome, Grand Ducal Florence, Republican Venice, Spain, and the Islamic Mediterranean. So where to next? At this juncture, I needed to determine if Navajaro's interest in describing the Alhambra and other fabulous places in Spain was sort of a one-off or part of a more thoroughgoing exercise on the part of travelers. It didn't take long to find out that his letters were part of a long tradition of Venetian travelers' accounts that were widely published and enjoyed both in Venice and beyond. As you might expect, the likelihood that a Venetian would come in contact with an Arab, a Turk, a Persian, or an Englishman was an outgrowth of the far-reaching tentacles of Venetian trade and the subsequent role played by Venetians as ambassadors for the Senate to foreign governors, with an eye out for the guarantee of continued profits, and if not friendly, at least correct relationships. Early modern travelers were exposed to new experiences and encountered peoples, places, and cultures never mentioned by ancient geographers or historians. These Venetian travelers, better known as viaggiatori in particular, introduced to their contemporaries a veritable host of foreign ideas, ranging from architectural styles to military tactics, and they were all deemed worthy of study as complements or alternatives to the theories and methods derived from Greek and Roman authorities. Some of the most loved travelogues published in Venice included Caterino Zen's account of his embassy to the east. What's funny is several of his ancestors, one Niccolo Zen and his brother, actually went to the frozen north, supposedly to the North Pole, and they actually were in Greenland and bathed in the hot springs there. Some years before Columbus went to the New World, supposedly. Caterino Zen himself spent 4 years in Turkey and Persia from 1481 to 1485. And during his travels, he wrote at great length about the things he saw. He described palaces and markets, warriors and washerwomen, and told readers that the East offered Venetians superlative examples of innovations in military operations, agriculture, hydrology, and the arts. The tone and message in Zen's account is echoed in numerous other travelogues, including those of Joseph F. Barbaro and Luigi Roncinotto, as well as the comprehensive guide to Italy written by Leandro Alberti that was printed in the 1550s. Barbaro's description of his travels in Persia and Roncinotto's rich treatment of Syria and Egypt were popular with the Italian audience. Barbaro's description of his 1436 trip to Tana and the Black Sea region is presented as an opening up of a world to Venetian readers that was known only to merchants and mariners. These descriptions also played a role in the manner in which Venetian nobles prepared to invest in gardens and country houses. Indeed, Aldo Manuzio's preface to the first published book in Venice to include these accounts tells us that for the announcement of many useful things for human life, much of the knowledge of all days again is gained from many places and countries through their travels, of which some will have been familiar or domestic in past centuries to our ancestors, but there also will come strange and unknown and new things for modern ears. One of the great early Venetian writers on geography was Lydio Sanuto, and his work was fruit of the pronounced trend in Venetian travel writing and geography to collect information and confirm this information firsthand. So rather than rely on what's been relayed by others or dredged up from older descriptions, Sanuto explained that he set out to quench the thirst and the natural desire that dwells in the noble spirit to see and know. Sanuto saw himself as a member of an elite class of observers, and thanks to the shifting winds of practice in the Veneto, he could expand his inquiry and introduce to his reader the full panoply of North Africa, rather than just recapitulate classical descriptions of the region. I'll go beyond the study of the histories of the ancients and moderns, Sanuto says, so that you will see the things of Africa, made famous by the Antiqui and those new facts that I have discovered. Similar sentiment appears in a more or less contemporary travelogue, Leandro Alberti's Descrizione della tutta Italia e isole appartenenti. By contrast to the rest of Italy, Alberti's work noted that Sicily had the unique privilege of lengthy Arab occupation. Alberti indicates that what he saw in February 1526 during a visit to Sicily was unusual in the Italian landscape and thus worthy of inclusion in his travelogue. He emphasized that the building complexes he visited and described, among them L'Aziza and Palermo, which you see on the slide here, that although in reality was a 12th century Norman palace, was typical of Islamic palaces built during their rule over the island. Alberti's vivid reconstruction of both the architecture and the spirit of L'Aziza certainly support an argument in favor of placing I Mori beside the Roman precursors. The arcuated fenestration of the elevations, polychromatic pilasters and attached columns imposes regularity of the surface of the palace, hinting at classical antecedents even as Alberti ascribes every detail to a Moorish flair for extravagant artifice. It's Alberti's inspired recreation of the Moorish spirit that pervade the ruined palace, which brings us again to the crux of the matter. As Alberti extends his discussion of artifice beyond the purely architectural features visible in the elevation, he returns his attention to a description of clear rushing water flowing through the central space, linking the cubic spaces that make up the palace and providing both soothing rhythms and scented atmosphere. It introduces them to his reader's experience of the palace. Alberti suggests that this same water channel, and you can see it in the center hall in two views in and out of the main center of this rather blocky structure, flowed from a central, splendid artificial spring. This doesn't look very artificial to me, but he calls it an artificial spring, and across a raised platform or a dining table, and it carried bottles of wine to those dining in the atrium. His Renaissance reader, perhaps a reader interested in villas and gardens, may have had images of in their head of Pliny's description of his Tuscan villa, replete with his area tablinum and the bowls of delicacies that waft across his own watercourse that he used to circulate plates at dinner parties in his villa just outside of Rome. Classical authors such as Pliny introduced Renaissance readers to one of the benefits of water in the villa. Alberti's memorable tale of Moorish life at L'Aziza provided readers with a parallel example of the Moorish use of water channels in the garden that underscore a common love for garden architecture between ancient Romans and I Mori, as he calls them, the Moors. Travel accounts like these contribute to our better understanding of Venetian early modern culture through their observations made in the course of voyages undertaken in the footsteps of generations of Venetian traders and ambassadors. These observations influence the form of the territory that would later supplant trade as the basis of Venetian wealth. Navigero and earlier viaggiatori exhibit a surprisingly Catholic Venetian vision of a world which seems to grow in complexity every moment. It's wrong for us to picture reactionary Venice grasping at the straws of Roman villa culture in the face of a downturn in international trade. In fact, instead, Cinquecento Venetians did not portray their republic as a state or society in eclipse. For Venetians, their polis, their republic was strong, but their villas now offered a new horizon, and the lands in the terra firma offered new opportunities for profits. To take full advantage of investments in this land, the Venetian clearly wished to learn everything they could about villa life and agriculture. And Venetians are not known for being really connected to the land. You know, a Veronese person still will call someone who can't ride a horse a Venetian, because if you can't ride a horse properly, you probably come from the lagoon where there were no horses. It's in this space that a man like Andrea Navigero operated, and his travels in Spain were a golden opportunity for his own firsthand study of Islamic landscapes, and what he saw, in turn, seems to have influenced his own gardens at home in Italy. The theoretical underpinning of my work rests on an awareness that of all the arts, landscape and garden design included, they're fundamentally mimetic. In other words, what you see is essentially what you get. The problem for anyone studying the Renaissance garden is that there really wasn't anything at all to see in terms of the Roman preceding objects that you might follow as your paradigms. Sculptors, hey, they had the Laocoon. Painters had groteschi that they found in the Domus Aurea. And architects had the Pantheon and a slew of ruined buildings they could mine for ideas and literally mine for bits and pieces that they could take and glom onto their new structures. In any event, a visual component seemed to be absolutely vital for the ongoing enterprise whereby Venetian Renaissance artists attempted to revive classical disciplines. Among the design arts, architecture really embodied the emphasis on visual analysis. While serving as the papal architect and head of an ambitious archaeological survey of Roman ruins under Leo X, himself a Medici, the painter Raphael admitted a personal heavy debt to Vitruvius, the Augustan era author of book on the art of building in 10 books. The problem he faced was a lack of illustrations. And thus, Raphael says, having been most interested in these antiquities and having taken no small pains closely to seek them out and measure them with care, and in reading the good authors to confront the works with the writings, I believe I've gained some knowledge of ancient architecture. Following the footsteps of 15th century architects, Raphael advocated the study of physical remains. It's worth noting that Raphael was close friends with Navagero, and they explored Rome together with mutual friends Baldassare Castiglione and Pietro Bembo. The group actually visited Tivoli together, and it appears that this trip was intended to help the Venetians get a handle on the Roman architectural legacy that was, by extension, an appropriate point of reference for the villas they were going to build in Venice. Bembo himself has a villa in the countryside that's really quite lovely. His emphasis on the study of objects in light of his own villa and landscape projects and his friendship with Navagero calls for a reevaluation of the Renaissance theory of garden design. Raphael's design for the so-called Villa Madama, which was being built for a Medici prince, the Cardinal Giulio, who later becomes Pope. He's the Pope during the sack of Rome, and his name is escaping me at the moment, sorry. But it was begun during Leo X's papacy on Monte Mario, several kilometers north of the Vatican outside of Rome. And his design paid homage to Hadrian's villa, but also to Pliny's Tuscan villa, with the inclusion of a number of features visible in the imperial complex near Tivoli and elements described in Pliny's letters about his villa. The Villa Madama's gardens were never constructed. The surviving plans do reveal, however, an effort to create a villa landscape based upon Pliny's gardens. Unfortunately, the absence of surviving ancient gardens and the lack of illustration in Latin sources left artists and patrons with only the faintest sense of the appearance and organization of a Roman garden. If Raphael's support for archaeological investigations can be considered a significant part of his architectural design practice, then the reinvention of a lost classical villa that he undertook for Pope Leo in the Roman suburbs, and that Navagero himself began with his villas on Murano and on the terra firma at his place he called the Villa Selva, would have benefited them also from a close study of the ancient landscape. The apparently unrelated issues of Roman architecture and Islamic gardens come together for me as twin elements in an early modern drive to use and involve observable fact to support or even perhaps supplant classical authority. Navagero's journey through Spain in 1525 and 1526 reinforced lessons learned from Raphael and others, and the poet turned statesman launched himself on kind of leisurely but thorough study of the history and natural history of Spain while in country. Although these letters have been used as the basis for cursory discussions of his gardens, there's been almost no acknowledgement of Navagero's active role in the revolution in land use, nor has there been much attention paid to his influence on the Venetian gardens as a major proponent of a hybrid garden, part humanist retreat, and based on the ancient landscape. His garden was not just a humanist retreat, it was also part botanical garden and part experimental farm, with component parts bound together through the literal and metaphorical flow of water courses. Navagero was a devoted classicist. He edited and published a number of works with Aldo Manuzio, including an early edition of the Rerum Natura by Lucretius. But when he traveled, he fell rather quickly into the role of viaggiatore and took in everything he saw. In Spain, he saw vestiges of antiquity, such as the Segovia aqueduct, and he saw baths inscribed with the name of Pompey. Apparently, the lingering atmosphere of Moorish Spain also captivated Navagero and led him on a hunt for traces of their years of what he thought of as relatively benign occupation. The mosques, palaces, and gardens required Navagero to explain himself to his friends back home because they were not familiar with these places and their gardens themselves. He then proceeds to juxtapose social commentary with descriptions of the Islamic landscape, directions for his gardeners actually in Venice, and discussions about New World exotica, seeds, fruit, and other things that he apparently sent home along with his letters. In fact, Navagero is connected with one of the first sort of moments of delivery of a potato to an Italian to actually see what the heck it was. Thus, there's little doubt that Navagiero expected his readers of his letters to ponder the nature of the Islamic garden as something of a formal statement of Muslim agricultural policy, and perhaps as a model for their own practice. Immediately after he declared that Spain was a land of more beautiful gardens than Italy, he indicated that his letters, he would bring all of you a buona Spagna. He would bring beautiful Spain to you in the next couple of pages. His letter, however, distinguishes itself from other colorful descriptions because he clearly intended to influence his friends to change their gardens based on what he had seen and collected in Spain. According to Navagiero, his friends should begin to put in their gardens and his, because they were not taking care of his place as kind of house sitting when he was away for 2 years, the things I located in Spain. He points out that his friends would do this for him. Upon his return, he would find in his selva an orto in Murano that was well planted in the manner of those Spanish gardens that he had seen and described. As a result, Navagiero's gardens would become two of the earliest Italian gardens redolent with the atmosphere of the amazing landscape of Spain and the New World. Sadly, Navagiero's property on Murano is now absorbed into a glass factory. There's a Vaporetto stop called the Navagiero stop, which tells you where it was, but there's nothing to see. And his Villa Selva, let me just go back 1, 2. Here in the province of Treviso, outside Treviso in the little town of Rovere, really has a much more thoroughgoing late 16th and 17th century classical geometrically designed Italian garden and doesn't show us much of what we might have seen if we were looking at his gardens as they were in the 1520s and 30s. For Navagiero, the remnants of Roman land improvements, such as aqueducts, provided a framework for the monuments that he saw in Rome and Tivoli and during his travels in Spain. Navagiero's amazement with the ancient way of moving water across valleys and through mountains at Segovia prepared him to appreciate the comparative subtleties of similar engineering in the Muslim gardens of the south. His recognition of the importance of the public bath, in fact, as a mark of advanced civilization that was left by Pompey and the Romans, not only reinforced the domination of Rome over the Mediterranean basin and Spain in particular, but also hinted at a continuity between the modern Muslim community and the Romans because they were similarly enamored of the ritual and regular use of the bath, which was very different from what Italians and Spanish individuals were doing in the 16th century. To Navagiero, the Spanish Muslims participated in a lifestyle and offered an aesthetic demonstrably in step with the Roman prototype. As the institution of the public bath had all but disappeared in the Christian world, the legacy of Rome, in this one instance, survived only in the Muslim world. Navagiero's descriptions of the Alhambra and the Generalife in Granada and the Patio de las Naranjas in Seville offer modern readers a sense of the atmosphere of this Moorish garden. His secretary, Giovanni Negro, also wrote a number of letters that included descriptions of these beautiful places. Negro wrote about the Alhambra in a letter to his father, and he calls it a place that was built a la Moresca, but it's not ugly, and that's why I like it very much. There are many fountains inside and pleasant places, and so many delights because from what can be seen, these Moors, that is to say their chiefs, did not intend to anything else if not to delight and pleasure. For Negro, the rich appointments and verdant surroundings exposed an Epicurean streak in the Moorish upper class. Negro was fascinated by Moorish customs and dress. He described obvious relish, sword-wielding spinning dancers. He talked about ships built around great trees that were full of musicians and mysteriously wrapped women. Negro had mixed feelings about the Moorish style of building, though, because pleased with the Alhambra, he found the juxtaposition of Moresca elements with new additions to the unfinished cathedral, for example, kind of an awkward thing. And it's true, if you go to Cordoba and you go into the Great Mosque, you'll see that in the middle of it, there is actually a Christian church that was blunked back down in the middle of the multi-columnar, wonderful Moorish building of the Great Mosque. So there's some really inelegancies, the way these two cultures smashed together at different times in their architecture that was seen by an Italian in the 16th century. A keen observer, Negro actually reserved his highest praise for the Moorish countryside and the Moors themselves. He did say the water is extremely cold in Granada, and all the fountains are fed from snow-covered mountains. He also identified a Moorish interest in country life. The surrounding countryside is more beautiful here than any other place in Spain because it's well worked and was cultivated by these Moors, and is full of trees and especially walls because they make their seats here. Now, he doesn't call these seats villas because the concept of a Moorish country house wasn't quite something he could wrap his head around, but it was really integrally connected to Islamic agricultural investment. And that established an immediate kinship between the Moors and contemporary Venetian villa owners who were thinking of the same things. The humanist and historian Navagero combined public and diplomatic business with a sort of intellectual tourism. He writes about his visit to the birthplace of Martial and Juvenal, the Latin playwrights and poets. He talks about finding Pompey the Great's suppression of the Spanish revolt and seeing inscriptions that talk about that. And he's amazed at the surviving monuments of Roman infrastructure. He also described different plants native to Spain and those arriving almost daily from the New World. The aspect of his journey most appreciated by later readers were his marvelous descriptions of the Moorish gardens, presented as an image of well-orchestrated manipulation of the natural and the man-made, where artifice and ingenuity transformed complexes of buildings, collections of fountains and watercourses, and flourishing greenery into a truly harmonious and inspirational environment. From Barcelona, he wrote on the 5th of May, 1525 to Giambattista Ramuzio, proclaiming that I'm here in a land, after all, that is infinitely like Italy, but with gardens more beautiful than I imagined could exist. After his harrowing journey, which left him sickly and glad to be on land, surprising for a Venetian since they're much more comfortable on boats than on horses, as I said, the ambassador immediately immersed himself in a quick but analytical survey of the bountiful and novel flora and fauna of Spain, which he promised to describe to Ramuzio after a short digression to instruct his colleagues on some new plantings for his gardens back home. Beautiful Barcelona was a fine introduction to Spain with its bellissimi gardens, its myrtles, orange trees, and cedars, all of which surrounded good and comfortable stone houses, far superior to the normal earthen dwellings he saw elsewhere that the Spanish lived in Catalonia. A keen observer, Navagero seemed to recognize the long history of the Moors in Spain. Near Toledo, Navagero described the Huerta del Rey, irrigated by massive anorie, or water wheels, powered by the river Tagus, and completely filled these gardens with trees and fruits. He says, in this plain is a ruined ancient palace. They say it was the palace of Galiana, daughter of a Moorish king from the time of the paladins of France, about whom they say many things, some historical, some fabulous. But in any case, the ruins show that it was a beautiful palace and on a very lovely and pleasant site. It's not surprising that Navagero was interested in fables about Moorish princesses. What's interesting is he locates Moorish history in antiquity. He describes the Palazzo Antico Ruinato as something built during the time of Roland and the French paladins, and he pushes Moorish occupation of Toledo back to the 9th century AD, and he ascribes legendary status to these Muslims. He connects them to the Battle of Roncesvalles, the Chanson de Roland, and Charlemagne, one of the 9 worthies. Fixing the Moors firmly into the historic past permitted Navagero as a historian to critically evaluate their actions and their monuments, just as he'd been commissioned to evaluate Venetian history by the Senate when they asked him to write a history of Venice. Navagero does not compare the Moors to the Romans in the same manner as he and Negro compared them to the modern Spanish. In fact, they really hated the modern Spanish and thought they were terrible landlords, ran their country poorly, and basically both treated Spaniards and other subjects horrifically. The ease, though, with which he moves between the discussion of the antique Moorish palace and the Norias on the Tagus, however, is to a description of a defunct water system which Charles had begun to reconstruct at a cost of 50,000 ducats and a very grand circus that was underway, suggest to him that all of these items are kind of equivalent parts of the historical landscape of Spain. Navagero did not identify the builders of the aqueduct or the circus. Presumably they were Romans, but it's worth considering how ready he was and how he assumed his audience would understand that both the Romans and the Moors left their stamp on Spain. Among the Moors' most spectacular monuments are the great palaces in Seville and Granada visited by Navagero. Maybe the most delightful place in Spain, according to Navajero, was the Alcazar in Seville. The palace of a very rich Moorish king. The Alcazar is beautiful and built in the Moorish style, with the most beautiful marble everywhere, and everything's dressed in a garment of water. There are baths and halls and many rooms through all of which passes the water. Place is most delightful in the summer. There's a patio full of orange trees and beautiful lemons, and inside more beautiful gardens, and between those a beautiful wood of orange trees that never admits sunlight. The Alhambra also dazzled Navajero. The gardens of the Moors in Granada, complete with clever jochi d'acqua and bountiful fruit trees, so impressed him that he took it upon himself to compose a very detailed description for Ramusio and his other Venetian friends. The walled Alhambra is like a castle separated from the rest of the city, inside of which remain a good number of houses, although the complex was dominated by a bel palazzo that was the residence of the kings of the Moors. This palace, says Navajero, was in truth very beautiful and sumptuously built of fine marbles, like all the other things. The marbles are not set in the walls, but on the floors on the earth. There's then a great courtyard or patio in Spanish fashion, very beautiful, large, and surrounded by buildings. But on one part has a singular and most beautiful tower called the Tower of Comares, in which there are some halls and very nice rooms with generous and commodious windows of very excellent Moorish work. So are the walls and ceilings of the apartment. Works partly in plaster with much gold, part in ivory and accompanying gold. The courtyard's completely clothed in the finest and whitest marble, which there are huge pieces. In the middle, there's a fountain, something like a canal, full of running water that enters this palace, conducts itself to every part, ending in the rooms. On one side and the other of this canal, there's spaliered myrtles with several orange plants. Navajero's description of the Torre de las Comares sounds very much like contemporary viaggiatori accounts of the wondrous residence of Islamic North Africa, the Middle East, and the Near East, particularly with the emphasis on the luxurious appointments and expensive-looking materials. Navajero betrays his personal interest in gardens, though, when he chooses to focus more upon what he calls the aqua viva, that brings the patio alive and transforms a collection of rooms that face on the courtyard into an integrated environment of partially enclosed rooms in the orbit of the fountain. The primary responsibility of the running water for raising the Alhambra above its neighbors and other Spanish palaces demanded respect from a Venetian and a gardener for many reasons, not the least of which was the delicate balance farmers and residents of the Venetian Republic sought between too much and not enough water. The rivers which cut through Granada, which Navajero claims were fed by the snow-capped Sierra Nevada range, provided an apparently limitless supply of fresh water for the erstwhile Moorish capital city. In addition, the Alhambra and the Generalife benefited from the existence of springs, which supplied water at the highest point of the city, obviating the need for water wheels or aqueducts like those he recorded in Cordova and Segovia. One of the more spectacular uses of this water was to be seen in the Court of the Lions. Similar to the complex of rooms he'd seen adjacent to the Torre de Comares, the marble-encrusted belt of buildings with a portico around a central courtyard are very fresh for the summer, but really not as comely as others. But there's one remarkable saving grace for this small corte. It's the fountain. In the middle of the patio, there is a most beautiful fountain, writes Navajero, that has been made with some lions that spit water from their mouths and give a name to the courtyard, which is called the Patio of the Lions. These lions hold up a basin of the fountain and are made in such a way that when no water is forthcoming, the man says a word in the mouth of these lions, saying as low as he wants, that if one puts an ear to the mouth of the other lions, the voice responds to each thing, so they say. There are also, among other things in this palace, some most beautiful underground baths, completely finished in the finest marbles. And these rooms are lit from the roof through many glazed places like eyes in each part. From the Patio of the Lions, Navajero passed through a secret door, leading out of the walled enclosure and into a garden higher up on the mount called the Generalife. His spelling was a little variable and he wasn't quite sure what that meant. The not very large palace has gardens with waters that made it the most beautiful thing that he had seen in Spain. The Generalife had more patios, all with abundant water, but of these there is one with running water that flows like a canal through the middle and is full of beautiful myrtles and orange trees, which there's a loggia, and that on the side looks outside is under 6 somewhat taller myrtles reaching almost the height of the balconies, which are equally tall and very thick. That flank not the tops of the trees, but an equally lovely and verdant meadow. These myrtles are all in front of the loggia at a distance of 6 or 8 paces. And the empty space that remains under them, there are innumerable rabbits, which you can see sometimes between the branches moving about, making a most beautiful view. The equal weight placed upon the architectural features of the courtyard, such as the loggia and the balconies, and the plantings of myrtle and orange trees, suggested that Generalife, or at least the court of the canal, is very different from even the Alhambra itself, which he saw only moments before. His earlier fascination with the playful fountains and the potentially magical sculptures carries over into his ecrasis of the delectable gardens, since the aqua corrente, or running water, continues to serve as like the lifeblood of the garden, circulating through each separate garden room and structure, and it thus becomes elements of a larger composition. In addition, the water, clearly fluid and surprisingly tuneful, partakes of both the natural and the built, permitting itself to be channeled by these industrious Moors without surrendering its fundamental role as a life-giving force for the trees and those rabbits that inhabit this garden. As he continues to describe the Generalife, the balancing act played by the garden waters becomes pronounced as the water feeds the greenery, enlivens the architecture, and teases the visitor. The water goes throughout the palace, Navagero writes, even in the rooms when it wishes, some of which you could make a pleasant home of in the summer. Although Navagero's description sounds remarkably like Leandro Alberti's, the latter's description of L'Aziza was published many years after Navagero's trip, and as a result, it would seem to be one of the earliest to focus on the specifically Moorish use of water in a residence. In one completely green patio, where a meadow is made with some beautiful trees, they made the water come in such a way by stopping some canals, so that if you happen to be standing in the meadow, the water will actually rise up over your feet, completely bathing everyone. In the middle of another courtyard was another fountain with a very large basin, and the pipes in the middle spouted water more than 3 braccia high, right? 3 meters, 9 feet. And at the highest point in the water, in a way that made the sweetest cascade of drops, and they exploded around and scattered themselves on every side, making it appear even more fresh to those who are regarding it. The water for these fountains and canals all sprang from beneath a rock, located in a large room in a garden slightly higher up the hillside. The water was made to, as he says, serve the palace by stopping the water with sluice gates so that one might make the water enter when one wanted and as one wanted. Control of the natural element, water, through sluice gates was something the Venetian expansion into the reorganized terra firma would integrate into drainage and irrigation of agricultural lands. The canals, controlled by such gates, supplied water not only for cultivation, but also for fish ponds and fountains in private gardens. The detailed description of the water systems of the Generalife must have been informative reading for Navagero's friends. The focus on the Islamic water systems reinforced the influence of their culture on the Venetian landscape, because the Italian word for sluice gate actually is saracinesca, right? It's a Saracen thing to control water. In other words, Navagero's description of the Generalife revealed Moorish technology and ingenuity apropos to Venetian villa design. As Navagero has already attributed all the agricultural improvements of Spain to the Moors and not the Spanish, it's not surprising that the component of garden design, which included hydraulic innovation, would be similarly linked with Moorish gardeners. One final selection from Navagero's description of the Generalife may suffice to close this analysis of his study of the Moorish garden. In this passage, the abundant waters at times rush from their spring down the hillside, and at times they're forced to stop, waiting perhaps for a future chance to irrigate and to delight. These stairs, he says, were made in such a way that each of the numerous stairs has a bit of a flat area, in the middle of which there's a concavity that can collect the water. On one side of the stairs, there are wells, and on the other, there are stone railings cut on the top like canals. Above these then, where the water is, there are locks which separate each part of these so that when they want, they may open these gates, holding back the water, then runs through the canals and in the wells. And when they want the water that's in the concavity that is in the flat of the stairs, and when they want all of them together, and they want an even larger quantity of water, it's in their power to make it rise higher, that their places cannot be entered. In this way, it scatters on the stairs. All the levers of it remain well washed, even bathing anyone that finds themselves there, making 1,000 jokes of this sort. The sheer joy of the ingenuity of the Moorish architects and engineers who direct or conduct sort of a ballet of aqua corrente permeates Navagero's letters. After giving the landscape a full treatment, he closes this section of his description of Granada with a short but pointed concluding remark that reminds us the importance of villeggiatura, the concept of going out to a villa and developing it, to Renaissance Italians like Navigero and his friends. In sum, it does not appear to me that in this place you miss anything of beauty and delight, whether or not you are one who knows and enjoys living in stillness and tranquility, or are given to the study and the pleasures appropriate for a gentleman, or maybe without the desire to embrace more. Certainly, this Venetian ambassador employs a superlative throughout the group of letters. Thus, it's unfair to really determine which is the most beautiful orange tree or fountain in Spain based on his comments. There seems to be no doubt, however, that the water stair particularly, and here's a little detail of it on the far right, charmed and delighted him, so much so that he chose this moment to restate his personal thesis about the nature of the garden as the ideal locus for tranquil retirement and the enjoyment of studies or other gentlemanly pastimes. The simple fact that this spectacular garden feature inspired Navigero to remind his correspondents of the rewards found only in the garden, while he tells them about a matchless landscape imbued with wit and grace by these omnipresent waters, makes it abundantly clear that these Moorish gardens were used for the same retreats, increasingly the focus of Italian patrons that were described in letters by Romans like Pliny. Gardens and villas have always entranced visitors and represent patrons and designers' best efforts to exhibit both a sensitivity to the natural world and their ability to transform the landscape, whether we're talking about a garden in Spain, in Granada at the Alhambra, or a garden outside of Rome in Bagnaia, where you can visit the Villa Lante, built by Cardinal Gambara in the 16th century. What continues to fascinate me is the principle that Renaissance gardens, long understood as part of an early modern imperative to recreate lost Roman models, also borrowed intentionally from other contemporary and historic examples that were carefully selected from across the Mediterranean world. Men like the ambassador Andrea Navigero and his friends, that included the artist Raphael and the historian and trendsetter Cardinal Pietro Bembo, were in the vanguard of an elite class of villa builders, and their practice introduced a wonderfully dynamic approach to villa and garden design that featured a surprisingly wide-ranging search for prototypes far beyond those gardens described by Roman authors, who men like Bembo and Navigero otherwise championed in cultural and intellectual arenas. Among these were gardens built and enjoyed by Islamic rulers in Moorish Spain and Sicily that served Cinquecento Venetians as a gateway to a better understanding of the delightful Roman gardens that had long since vanished. In the next decades, the most renowned gardens in central Italy incorporated features like water chains and water stairs that evoked those Navigero saw in Spain. Indeed, a friend of Navigero's, Giulio della Torre, who actually was one of the recipients of some of his letters from Spain, built a villa and a garden outside Verona in the village of Fumane. It's situated a decidedly Vitruvian rusticated courtyard palace amidst a series of water features that flowed through the palace, just as the Acqua Corrente was central to the experience of L'Aziza and the Alhambra. In this image on the left, this fountain and garden, this little bit of stone here was actually an open water channels many years back. And it connects fountains in the upper garden with the central courtyard and a grotto below with the rest of the garden. Here's the courtyard. The water flows actually from spring up the hill, down through vineyards. This is now owned by a winery, the Allegrini winery. And then it connects to water in these fish ponds here that you cross with a bridge, and then comes out in this grotto, and then carried in an open water course according to Venetian plans from the 16th century for hydraulic investments in the Villa della Torre property, and fed the rest of their agricultural lands, which are down the hill. So in the end, a group of Venetians and their Italian colleagues and friends introduced design features and a sensibility to nature that Navigero described as central to the Moorish, Spanish, Iberian landscape and attitude. And it changed their approach to landscape design as they took new cues from this Moorish past. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions.
I have a few for you, Christopher, but before I start sending them on, thank you very much. That was a fabulous trip and an interesting, world that I think a lot of people do, or moment in the world that people don't know a lot about. And obviously that the whole issue of the plurality of sources of inspiration for Italian gardens is fascinating. And I mean, would you say still pretty much under-recognized, under-researched?
I believe that it's still under-recognized, and I don't think it's tremendously well-researched because connecting all the dots is hyper-complicated. I try to streamline it a little bit as much as possible. And there's a real visual affinity between the Alhambra and, say, the Villa Monte, but there are lots of visual affinities that may not actually be bad. They could just be, accidental similarities. I've tried to make a more active argument for an intentional connection between these two things, but I don't think it's something that lots of folks study because usually, especially in art history and architectural history, as well as in garden history, we're often period experts and we work on a certain part of the world, and we seldom wander between these different areas and look at ways that the ideas could travel and be transmitted, which is exactly what your seminar is doing, but that's not done by everybody. I have found other examples outside of Navigero where this kind of communication happens. So for example, a grandnephew of Pietro Bembo actually builds a really wonderful house and garden on the mainland after he was an ambassador. And during his travels, he actually took an artist with him to Egypt. And this artist actually had tremendous, wonderful sketches of places that they saw that clearly this individual, I think his name is, let's see, which Bembo is, I have to think hard, building his palace in the 1670s, actually connected his funny little padiglione to a garden that looks a lot like the gardens that his artist drew in Egypt, right? So there's clearly this interesting interest and an effort to execute this transmission of ideas, but it's usually done with artists. And as I used to say, I worked on villas that were not designed by Palladio, right? I work on gardens mostly that are now gone and you can't visit. And so it's hard for historians to really show them to people because some of the things that really make this argument sort of explode into your consciousness are invisible. So sadly, I'm kind of like a Renaissance, 16th century Italian wanting to build a garden and a villa that's just like a Roman one, and he has nothing to look at.
Yes, well, this cycles on and on, doesn't it? That it is interesting, but I hope you'll keep going and other people pick this up. We have some interesting questions. The first, it really is about Padua and the botanic gardens there, and looking at I think it was your very first slide, the circular garden. Do you see Padua and that form of garden as in any way being linked to the Islamic world, or those gardens?
Absolutely. In fact, what's fascinating is the University of Padua was actually effectively the home university of the Venetian state. There is a university in Venice now, but there wasn't at the time. Venetians could take courses in actuarial accounting procedures, but not noblemen in Venice proper. All Venetian noblemen who wanted to study and get degrees almost exclusively went to the University of Padua, which, unlike all the other Roman Italian universities at the time, had not been founded as a seminary. It was a school of law, and its second important sort of discipline was natural philosophy. And that's what centrally supported the development of the Ordo Botanico in Padua. So for example, when Navigero studied and Pietro Bembo studied, they went to university and they learned Latin, they became classicists, and they became Venetian statesmen. They didn't study liturgical or religious philosophy. In fact, they studied law and science. They were very Aristotelian at Padua. And so both the plants, the simples that were grown in the botanical garden for medicinal purposes, which were used in the medical school at Padua, which is really its claim to fame now, were connected, root and branch, so dramatically more so than the education of other nobles in the Italian peninsula, that the botanical garden is hugely connected with this thing. So I did a lot of work on Venetian educational history as part of my research. And one of the things that I studied, which is why I ended up writing a paper on syphilis and Girolamo Fracastoro, country houses, and the New World. So much so that I gave a paper one time, and it was one of the few that my wife traveled with me. And she was kind of both entertained and horrified by the fact that on day 3, we were getting on the elevator and somebody says, "Hey, it's the syphilis guy." But they were really fascinated by plants and what they could do for medicinal purposes. And so the round garden in Padua was supposed to describe the known world and the plants from the known world. And originally it didn't have major walls surrounding it. It had a really interesting ring of sharp-toothed, pronged pyrocanthus plants that have the bright orange berries to protect everything inside from the outside. But it was understood as part of the laboratory of the Venetian elite. And everything that came in and potentially went out of that garden was supposed to help them understand what were the most profitable, the most valuable, and the most beneficial plants that they could plant in a property in the Veneto to make money and to preserve public health and well-being. So it's totally integrated into this process. And that's one reason that, like, Navaggero describing the beautiful Moorish agricultural landscape is so important, because he saw that the modern Spaniards didn't care about that at all. They were all hidalgos who wanted to beat and enslave and take taxation money away from the people who made these lands so fecund and profitable. So the Ordo Botanico is hugely important in this.
I'm going to ask you a later question. I was going to go in order that they in which they flowed in, but this is directly relevant to Padua, which is a question asking whether you agree with John Prest and this idea of the Botanic Garden and what its relationship might be to Islamic and pre-Islamic paradise, as it were.
I think that Prest is onto something in the general sense that almost all gardens, once they're identified as particularly coherent spaces that are bound in some way, they're a paradisos, right? They're bound by walls, and they are mimetic or reflective echoes of that first garden, right? But what I particularly find interesting in thinking about it is with Prest particularly is his idea of talking about Christ as the first gardener, right? And Adam as his maybe avatar or scion in that regard. Because who does gardening and what they grow and how they grow it is really quite important. So for Navaggero, right, he's a nobleman. He's a diplomat. He's a poet and a writer and a classicist. Highfalutin, right? And the key is he's also a senator. And you cannot be a member of the Senate if you work in trade, right? For multiple generations. And what's interesting is that Navaggero saw that type of active noble gardener, right? Which Christ represents and Adam represents in paradise as a noble, important thing, as something that justified being the person who not only had a gardener, but also went out with his gardener and said, no, we got to plant the trees here and we got to run the water there. So as opposed to being a dilettante or a gentleman farmer, instead he was an active participant. And what this allowed, and it's really quite wonderful to see in the Venetian archives during the 16th century, is as Navaggero and Ramuzio and people like that invested in land, and they made it more productive by draining it or irrigating it, doing both, taking water away, adding water back, it never smacked of trade or merchant activity, and they didn't jeopardize their noble status. And Christ as that noble gardener, right, first and foremost, is sort of a paradigm figure, helped with that. And that connected them then through other examples like Romans, right? Noble Roman senators are well known as people who, they didn't dabble in trade maybe, but what they did is they actually collected plants and built gardens and hosted people in these parties and lived in villa. They went to the villa for rest and relaxation, but also to develop new ideas. And it was part of their intellectual life purpose. And then what I saw, and press sort of took me this, is thinking about these gardens as part of the legacy of the ancient Near East, right? Trying to locate the Garden of Paradise and the Tigris Euphrates up a certain way from some of the way the rivers ran and all that kind of stuff, is that there are other non-Roman and non-European gardeners who show this noble affinity for the landscape. One of the great gardeners in their minds is King Cyrus, right? From Xenophon's Economia and Chiropedia, where he talks about Cyrus as this new example of the great leader of men who himself, when he steps away from the battlefield, actually designed and built his own gardens, right? And that's a perfect model for someone like Navigero, because this is a king, a nobleman. And so it's connected with Press and that paradise garden as well, because that paradisos is actually a derivative word from ancient, the ancient Iranian language that then gets transliterated into Greek and comes from there. So they're actually all linked up. So Press is, and the garden, botanical garden, the Garden of Eden, they're all sort of in the backstory.
They're all together. This is not my question, but I'm just going to say the word otium because that came to mind as well. But the question that I'd like to follow with is directly related to Christ the First Gardener, in that we have a question about gardeners, real gardeners. Were Moorish gardeners or Spanish gardeners of any type brought to Italy in this period? Is there any evidence? I
don't see any evidence of that. I know they brought potatoes and tomato and corn and things. They brought and showed people and slaves from the New World as examples. I don't know of any Islamic gardeners. I do know of Italians, again connected with Padua, who go to the Near East to work and studied under Islamic doctors, for example, and wrote treatises in modern medicine that were published in Italy. So there's other vehicles for the transmission of ideas that seem to really make this connection. But I don't know of anybody that hired a landscape gardener, primarily because by the time Navigero's there, you know, we're 1520s, we're 30 years past the Reconquista, closing the doors in 1492. Because just as Columbus is coming here to, you know, eventually wipe out our indigenous peoples through smallpox, Ferdinand and Isabella have conquered and taken possession of the Iberian Peninsula and make their new capital city, Granada. And so I think that there probably are leftover, you know, mestizos who are Morisco by inclination, but I don't know that they become part of the world of the service class, like in the design environment for landscapes. Haven't found that. Would sure love to.
I'm just thinking, you mentioned Sicily. I mean, it seems to me that Sicily at certain moments is extremely, it's a huge cauldron of cultures. Would the Venetians look to Sicily, for instance, to see this Islamic kind of garden making or culture? Would that be seen as a source?
I think they would have, which is why I think that Alberti's book sold more copies once he added all the islands, right? Because Sicily suddenly becomes this really new place to hear about that was harder to get to, that had, as you said, this sort of strange melting pot of historical conquest moments, right? So there's Greek, there's Siculan, there's Roman, there's Carthaginian, there's Moorish, there's Muslim, there's Norman, there's Turkish. I mean, if you can't find it there, you kind of can't find it anywhere. The trick is excavating or peeling back all the layers to get to the bit that's maybe able to be like concretized and confirmed in your head as having some sort of deeper meaning and sort of transmissible use up the ladder, if you will. And that's what I think Alberti did with describing L'Aziza. He worked really hard to do that. And I think the Venetians would have really been interested in that as well.
A question about more influence on Venice and the Veneto. How aware would they have been of the Medici and for instance, does Belli have any influence elsewhere in this kind of context?
I think the gigantic expansion of the Belli project of the gardens under the Grand Dukes, is really a sort of dominant exercise in transforming the landscape that reverberates in a lot of different ways. I feel that it's the bits that we know the least about in the Belli Gardens that maybe the most reflect my concept that it's not just the fancy waterworks that matter, but oftentimes it's a subsidiary working water that connects garden spaces and makes them outdoor rooms, but that they're somehow coherently connected to the larger set piece. So I feel that it's there, but I think that it oftentimes gets subjugated in interest to the spectacular individual set pieces. It's hard to really document it. But I mean, prior to this, people would have said, well, there's no way you can connect the Belli to the Alhambra. But I don't think any of those people knew that Ferdinando de' Medici, who spent most of the money to grow that garden, actually was fascinated by the Arab world, right? He had a tremendous collection of oddities, both from the New World and from Islamic Spain that he collected. So I think they were really tied into that and fascinated by it. And so they send all these little signals out here and there of that connection, but it's not something I think you can, if you just walk into that garden itself, is immediately before your eyes.
Apparent.
So I think we walk away from not really making that connection.
Yeah. A question about openness. I absolutely adored what you said. I'm going to try to find where I wrote it down. Nuns' habits, togas and turbans, and this incredible openness. I was sitting here thinking about seafaring people being outward looking, tending to be, without being too, cut and dried about it. But another question has come in. Could it be that the Venetians were more open to Moorish ideas because they weren't so close to Rome? They weren't under the papal thumb.
Yeah, I think that is certainly an important element. So, for example, I showed you the picture of the bell tower of San Pietro in Castello. That's the Cathedral of Venice, but it's not the central church in Venice. It's way back in the middle, behind the arsenal in Castello. The main ritual center for religious life in Venice is St. Mark's, but that's only the chapel of the Doge, right? So Venetians are really well aware of this fact that they are Venice and they are actually not Rome and not connected to the Roman Church. But what they see is that their city was founded in a way early in the days during the Roman era, but it never had the taint of sort of the strange episodic papal domination. So they're really, I think, always interested in enunciating that. So I think that's one thing. You're right. And I think the second thing about this sort of openness that's quite fascinating for me is that, again, they were not really closely tied to the European enterprise. They were more closely tied to the perpetuation of their own republic, right? Which they saw having a different governmental model in which all levels of the citizenry were somehow participatory, right? So they were sort of like the ideal political state, right? Where they had an autocrat, an oligarchy, and a democracy, all that talked to one another and ruled the city. And this was something that Rome, the papacy, didn't understand and couldn't comprehend. So I think they saw some of that stuff as a reason to look elsewhere. What I also think that they saw as travelers, as a seafaring people, as you mentioned, is that the more places you went, the more you learned from those people that you encountered. And they brought that, sort of accidental encounter into a more of an enterprising entrepreneurial approach to what they did every day. So if they were going to try and corner the market on glass, for example, when they really developed that technology, they're going to go and try and figure out what are the best prototypes and how to make sure they have the best raw materials and the best craftsmen, and try and control the marketplace for that, which they did, to the point where I think the folks in the glassworks who were most capable of making large sheet glass in Venice, and the glass floats in a bed of mercury, it's really dangerous to do. They had to sign contracts, and they left Venice. They weren't allowed to leave the boundaries of the Republic. And if they left, they were sought out on pain of death, right? Because that was an important control. I don't know that they're quite as controlling in other areas, but they really sure that knowledge was hugely valuable. And so to them, the knowledge they could get about medicine, about science, about shipbuilding, about anything in the world, including gardens, could come from sources that maybe their colleagues or their counterparts in the rest of Italy wouldn't have necessarily gone to as resources.
And also, while you were speaking, I thought that, again, coming back to geographic location, which you've talked about quite a lot, up at the top, they're facing out to other countries, other cultures. Whereas if you're down in the leg and at the boot, you're facing the water, or you're facing inward,
right?
Into the peninsula. So that's really very interesting. I think it's been fascinating, and you've got a lot of thank yous here, and a lot of people saying thank you for the food for thought, and it's really given us a lot to talk about. I think we will be talking about this for quite some time, and it's been a wonderful contribution to these conversations we're going to have. I think because it's 20 past the hour, we should wrap up now. So I just will remind everyone that the next seminar in 2 weeks is Dr. Gregory Missingham, and this will be looking at Chinese gardens and concepts around real gardens, paper gardens, thinking about gardens. So please join us for that. But thank you so very much, Christopher. I don't feel like racing over to Italy right now and going under the barbed wire and like getting more pictures.
Yeah, my as I mentioned earlier, my daughter was going to jump on. She's at University in California, but your daylight savings time is different than ours this year. So she's in class, so she's going to watch the recording. But I said, well, maybe I need to take her to Granada, and I'll redo the talk there so she can get a sense of the space.
I think you do.
I think it's on the vacation list.
Now you've committed in front of dozens of people, so you'll have to do that. So thank you very, very much. Thank you everyone for coming, and happy dreams of Moorish Spain and Italy. Thank you very much.
Really pleasure to speak with you all. And I put my email in the chat. If anyone has questions, feel free to email me. It's always fun to talk about gardens. It's more interesting than my day job. So I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating. So much to do.
Yeah, and it's there's always more to do.
There's always more to do. There's always more to to sleuth, and as you say, without the existing gardens and without the routes to them being signposted,
right?
Everything takes so long, doesn't it? But that's it. You'll be happy for the rest of your life. Did you ever think about trying to be based for a period in Spain or Italy?
Well, actually, when our honeymoon was actually to retrace Andrea Navajero's route in Spain. So I had a grant, and we spent 3 weeks, and I dragged my wife all to a lot of backwaters just to see particular buildings and things in the current state of affairs. We had a great time. She saw places that most tourists don't see, but that was pretty entertaining. And I was in Venice for a year, and I've been back several times, although not lately, doing some particular, sort of on the ground investigative work, a lot of archival work. Hard to explain to, certainly like my Italian roommate once was surprised at all the strange Italian words I knew for different kinds of plants, but I didn't know basic words like the word for spoon. And I said, well, it tells you what I read all the time. But yeah, so I've done some work there. I would like to go back with the different tools we have at our disposal now, simply because I think there's some things I'd like to sort of dig into and maybe see if I could find some of that physical connectivity. But it's, it's not part of my regular run of duties now at the university as a full-time administrator. Like I don't have the summer off to do research and travel and things like that. So I lose out some of the chances to sort of build out this argument with certain, I think, key pieces of visual evidence. So, it's sort of it's always on the back burner. So it was really wonderful to spend some time with you guys and sort of bring it out into the open. I very appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time, because when I was looking at what you do in your day-to-day, I got very, very tired. And I thought, my goodness, it is full on. There's no escape. I can see that. So thank you very, very much. I can see Pippa and Michael Ann and Steve, three of our co-conveners. Before we let Christopher slip away, do you have any burning thoughts or questions? Any of you? We've all been waiting for you, Christopher. So, speak now or hold your peace.
Can I make an observation? Can I make an observation?
Yes, go ahead, Malcolm.
My late colleague, the distinguished agricultural historian Joan Thirsk, for a couple of years before she died, was trying to establish whether Moorish agriculturalists came in from Spain into England in the 16th century. I don't know how far she got with her research. Her papers are at the University of Leicester. But she wrote me several letters saying that she was convinced that some of these Moors in Tudor England were, in fact, agriculturalists and gardeners from Spain.
You'd love to see if that sort of real, like, personal movement, as opposed to the movement of ideas, was part and parcel of this, because if we found it going one direction, you might find it going other directions. And I sort of try to trace it, because you look at, sort of wills and documents. You can see books they owned and sort of therefore books they read, plans and investments, and how they valued them in places like Italy and places like England. There's a tremendous paper trail in that regard, oftentimes, that can be really insightful. But then the trick is you don't oftentimes see that. If you could find like the journals of the monthly expenditures, and you can see the names of individuals who are paid, that's where you would find that kind of evidence. I unfortunately, as I said, I work on these less well-known villas so they don't sort of have that kind of paperwork surviving. There's a lot in the Venetian archives that was sent to the government center for the Beni Ambientale at the time, where they were filing requests and approving or denying changes to the water regime, meaning like you could drain, or you could flood, or you could take 30% of the water flow down a navigable or non-navigable river. So you see that, so you can understand what's going on in their head about how they're going to make this water do more work. And then you'll see the name of the engineer. And later on, you'll find that engineer left a sketch. So then you can make that argument that engineer was actually part of the villa design team, not just an engineer. But they're all, for me, in Venice, so far, all largely Italians. I haven't found like the one-off odd, he's one-off odd name that sort of suggests that it's somebody that was imported as an expert, right, from a place like Spain or a place like Egypt. Haven't found it yet. But if someone did somewhere else, that would be really fascinating.
Can I ask if there is any evidence whether the Venetians were interested in what the Moors were thinking when they were designing places like the Alhambra? I'm thinking particularly of the Lion's Court, which I think is designed as it is because it echoes the creation story that's common to all the three desert religions. Were the Venetians interested in that, and did they care?
I think they did, much as the Florentine, like Ferdinando de Medici, was saying, hey, we can learn from the Quran and we can learn from Islamic commentaries on Euclid, right? And they can learn from us. I think the Venetians were interested in learning. We know Andrea Alpago, one of the early public intellectuals on medical sciences, was really well versed in Arab treatises on medicine. So I think they were really interested in these ideas, right? And I think they're really interested in their ideas on, and they published and collected Arabic versions of Dioscorides' work on plants. So the philosophers, the scientists, the mathematicians, and the agriculturalists in the communities that the Venetians encountered were all fair game, I think, in their head, which is why I sort of have come up with this idea that there's this expanded antiquity, right? It used to be, we said the Renaissance, and I know I teach Italian Renaissance art, and I'm teaching the intro. Hey, it's all about like taking a page from Petrarch improving medieval Latin by looking at classical Latin and fixing the language that had been bastardized, right, in the Dark Ages. And that Italian art does the same thing, right? So Giotto is starting to think about how to make big, solid figures that look more human, that to him look more like Roman figures and not like skinny medieval figures, let's just say. And then Michelangelo and all that are seeing the Laocoon, they're doing the same thing, right? I think that sort of direct, simple explanation, which works great in an introductory class, I mean, you have to tone it down and walk it back, sort of is in play for architecture and for garden architecture, because the idea of having a villa and what you do there, right, is connected to odium negodium, as Christine mentioned, right? Leaving business and going to the country to think and enjoy and relax. But the Venetians saw the country as a place to win in the marketplace, not just of ideas, but in the financial marketplace, because they could make land more valuable. And the only way they could do that was to find ideas from other people who knew how to make that land more valuable, as opposed to just cropland, right? The Venetians figured out if they did certain things, they could make a mint growing rice and feed everybody and not be beholden to imported grains. Where's rice come from? The subcontinent through the Arab world. So they totally were interested in Islamic agriculturalists and their ideas because they had been and were recognized as the sort of jumping off point for tremendous developments in agricultural sciences. So I think it's really, really, an appreciated pathway that I think the Venetians really grab onto.
Yeah. Thank you.
For me, the question oftentimes was how they justified it, right? Because the Christian world, especially with what the papacy's banging their drums about the Ottomans and the Turks and the Muslims as the enemy, the Venetians have to tiptoe around that in many cases to try and figure out how to get those things they need, advance those relationships they think are valuable, and play a sort of rather delicate sort of diplomatic game in the process. Yeah. And that's, I think that, so to me, what they often try to do is disassociate, say, the Moors of Spain from just being adherents to Islam, but instead to be what I saw as true, similarly parallel lines of descendants from classical Rome to modern Italians, right? So they were participatory in building on the Roman foundation, and that made them legal, right? Because just like a scientist, a mathematician, a geometer, or a physician could be seen as an heir to Galenic medicine, right? So it didn't matter if he was actually an Arab in Syria and Damascus, right? Because he was really channeling classical education that was really poorly understood and largely almost inaccessible to modern Italians.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to dream and I'm going to visit there tonight. That's what I feel like. I feel so full of this. It's fantastic. It's just so interesting.
And I actually see that some of these things come along, to me to try and tie it all together in more sort of pathways in more subject areas. So, for example, one of the things that I was always fascinated about was this exercise in trying to figure out at what point were Turks acceptable, right? And at what point weren't they acceptable? Where on the scale, right? Do they go from arch enemy to business partner to diplomatic partner to potential resource? And the Venetians were really fun, and so were other Europeans in doing this, and saying, if you want to know how to hunt an ostrich, the best way to do it is to watch how the Ottomans do it. So see, they're not bad at everything. The things they do well, we could do well by parroting their successes. And so I think that the Venetians were educated, oftentimes by travel and experience, and they were dynamic and flexible in their willingness to respond and borrow ideas. So they didn't worry about anybody saying, oh, you're culturally appropriating something from a Muslim. No, we're actually learning how to hunt ostriches. And we're going to figure out how to hunt big game ourselves better, because we can see when we travel, we're invited to go on these ostrich hunts.
Mhm.
So I think they're really pretty, as I said, not in the religious term, but in the broad term, very Catholic in how they approach the Muslim world.
The mixing of cultures and peoples in Venice is exemplified in Thomas Coriat's description
Absolutely.
of St. Mark's Square. He was fascinated by all the different people in different clothes to be seen there.
Mm.
Yeah, so they were really, but for me, the Venetians were different than the English in this regard, in that they weren't just interested in how they looked, and they were, and they othered them and said they're different but cool. Instead, they said they're different and cool and kind of useful, right? And it's that next step, going from they're different and cool and exotic to also potentially valuable partners in more than just trade or more than just diplomatic control, but also in the trafficking in ideas. And I think that was something that was surprising to me, and I really tried to build out more successfully for myself.
Because are you saying because that's innately more egalitarian, that's innately more respectful? I want to trade ideas with you, or I want to be your partner, rather than, wow, this is cool and different.
Now, I don't
Or
know
is
if
that
I
too
would
hard?
say, yeah. I think there's some interesting options there. The Venetians, since they did point out how horrible the Spaniards were, both to lower class Spaniards and to the Amerindians, there's some interest in recognizing that there's something interesting about being transnationally egalitarian, right, as all equal humans. But I'm not sure that the patron elite class goes quite that far. So sometimes I think they may be also sort of trending towards just being exploitative of and willing to borrow and deploy new ideas, but not necessarily worry about making sure everybody else is equal in the process.
No, I didn't mean that. No, yeah.
But they recognize some funky things. So for example, one of the great quotes from Italian Renaissance, right, is after a war, the one person who's involved at the governmental level says to the rest of the government officials, their Swiss beat our Swiss. Because they all hired mercenaries and they were all from Swiss cantons. And they took turns coming from Switzerland to fight for the Italians for cash. And they did it for so many months at a time. So they recognized other people did some things really well. But what was fascinating is further in that discussion, they point out that all those Swiss were farmers, and they worked really hard to develop a culture and society that could bring outside cash in to use to develop Swiss agriculture to feed themselves even when they couldn't be at home, when they had to leave. So they were capable of looking at people, and they were really, quite frankly, both amazed by and appalled by the Swiss, because they become really dramatically Protestant and horrible by the time we get into the 1520s and 30s. But they're still a fabulous for-hire military power. So seeing the Italians, to them, the Swiss were potentially more horrible than any Ottoman you could ever find. But they also were people that you could see did something superlatively well. And so you had to say, I'll tip your hat to them. So it's really, really strange and exciting to read about sometimes.
Mm. Well, I think everybody probably thanks you with me and is feeling full of just ideas and wonder. And we want you to write your book. So get right on it, okay? and keep in touch with our seminar. If you know,
Thanks so
keep
much.
it in mind in case you see a conversation you like. We'd love to have you in the writing comments in the chat box.
Wonderful. Will do. Thanks again. And I'll see you again soon.